Here we go. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. It's so good to see all these people. My name is Ann Wilson, and I am with the Santa Clara County Move to Amend affiliate. We are here today to introduce Move to Amend. It's our first barnstorming event, is what we call it, when we go out and try to explain Move to Amend to folks who have not heard of it yet. Santa Clara County affiliate is in San Jose. Move to Amend is a national organization that is moving to amend the Constitution to bring about a more fair democracy, which you'll hear about. Greg Coleridge will be our speaker. He is here from the national, there's a national Move to Amend team, and Greg is the outreach director. I will post, Santa Clara County Move to Amend is hosting this event. And so if you're in the Santa Clara County area, San Jose, you're welcome to join us. We meet once a month, the first Wednesday at 7 p.m. We usually meet down at the San Jose Peace and Justice Center, but recently we've been on Zoom. So I will post our email and website. You're welcome to join us anytime. And Greg will be speaking for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So thank you so much again for being here. And I turn this over to Greg.
Well, thank you very much, Ann. Can everyone hear me? Just put a thumbs up. Very good. Well, greetings. It's very good to be here. Thank you so much for choosing to spend at least an hour or so of your time. Hopefully it will be worthwhile. All right, so the most challenging part of the whole evening for me may be this, sharing the screen. So let's see if I can do that here without causing too much of a mare. Here we go. Let's see if this works. Can everybody see that? Nope, guess not. Let's try it again. Okay, now let's try this. All right, so not perfect, but not bad. Hopefully everybody can see that. I will move this over this way. Well, very good. So this is an introduction to Move to Amend. I was told that the goal of the presentation this evening was to try to appeal to, if you will, newbies, or maybe to give a refresher for people who may not over the last couple of days anyway, maybe been up to date with Move to Amend doings. So here goes. Some of this may be quite repetitive, and I know that this group is very well respected and has done some excellent work over the years. So you are not neophytes to this topic by any means. So what I'm going to do is, here we go, try to get going here. All right, once I do this. All right, so let's begin. The mission of Move to Amend, and thanks so much, Ann, for sort of shaping and providing some background to it. It's a coalition of hundreds of organizations and 1,000 individuals committed to social and economic justice, ending corporate rule, and building a vibrant democracy that is genuinely accountable to corporate interests, but to we the people. And when we say we the people, we mean the people. Our goals are basically twofold: to pass what we call the We the People Amendment, which is a piece of legislation that's been introduced in the House of Representatives, H.R. 48, to make clear that artificial entities do not have constitutional rights and that political money spent in is not equivalent to First Amendment free speech. So there's two major components to it. But second, the goal is to provoke discussion and organizing about how to make real the promise of democracy through what we call constitutional renewal.
Got this thing going there.
So we believe that the We the People Amendment is just basically kind of the first step to fundamental constitutional renewal. Our principles and values, we have 5 of them. We believe it's very important to focus on anti-oppression and solidarity organizing. By anti-oppression, we mean to focus on people who have historically not been treated equally from the get-go in this country and who are on the front line today, literally today, focusing on racism, sexism, homophobia, and other forms of historic oppression, to form organizing that is solidarity in consort with their concerns, working to build coalitions, to build a movement, because we know historically any change fundamental to bring about positive, progressive, democratic change has always involved building a movement, an inclusive, nonviolent democratic movement that seeks to build power. We believe that change, and so grassroots organizing from the bottom up is extremely dedicated to political education. You know, we haven't learned much of what is money in politics or corporate personhood, corporate constitutional rights. At least I didn't in school or even in traditional activist circles. So we're trying to get on the other side of the learning curve, which is sort of a perpetual challenge. And lastly, we're dedicated to not just economic independence, but political independence. We are transpartisan, and we're not economically to any foundation or corporation or union or government or any other large entity that could pull strings, which we know is a fact with other groups that have been economically compromised, if not politically compromised. Our structure is we have a national board, a leadership team that is very diverse in terms of race and gender and geography, a national staff. I think there's 8 of us, several interns, local affiliates like yourself. There's about 5 to 50 of those around the country. There's something we just started called individual advocates, where short of having an affiliate in a geographic place, it can be an individual person who carries, if you will, the Move to Amend torch in their community and tries to do individually much of what groups would do, but on a much smaller scale. But most importantly, to try to reach out and build coalitions and solidarity. We have amendment working groups that are other organizations that do other things, but may have one projects being to try to pass the We the People Amendment. And lastly, there are just coalition partners, groups we work with, and independent supporters. The We the People Amendment, basically, here's the language. There's actually 2 main components, and then a third one that we put in that we believe is unnecessary, just to underscore the fact that this amendment would not abridge freedom. And so the 2 major components of it is, as mentioned, the rights protected by the Constitution are the rights of natural persons only, as opposed to artificial entities. Those being corporations, limited liability companies, and other entities shall have no rights, constitutional rights anyway. Statutory rights and protections is a different matter. If you want to get into that, we can, under this Constitution, and are subject to regulation by we the people. And second, federal, state, and local governments shall have the power to regulate, limit, or prohibit contributions and expenditures. And the judiciary shall not construe the spending of money to influence elections to be speech under the First Amendment. So, 2 provisions. Folks in general have a pretty good handle on what it means and the impact of big money in elections and how that is corrupted, corroded, distorted, hijacked, usurped, pick your favorite adjective, our political process. So I'm not going to focus on that, only because we have limited time and only because relatively individuals are less familiar with this notion, corporations having inalienable constitutional rights. So that's really what I'm going to focus on mostly. And we believe that things like the Green New Deal, Medicare for All, a big democracy reform piece of legislation that was introduced last year, HR 1, environmental policies, consumer protection, worker protections, police reforms, you name it. So many of the issues, economic, environmental justice, and the like, basically are contingent on there not being constitutional rights of corporations, big money in elections. Because if those things are present, basically on those issues that we care about, we're not going to get very far in being successful. So we believe that ultimately the crisis we're facing is not simply, when it comes to political crisis, one that is connected to politics, though that certainly is part of the problem, but ultimately a democracy crisis that transcends simply money politics, which we're going to get into. This year, of course, is quite critical, as we all know, and as we all have lived through, to not just react, respond, and resist to the multiple crises out there, from health to economic to environmental to police brutality, so many, but to proact, go on the offense, if you will, to call a fundamental change. Because without authentic democracy governments, the legal authority to self-rule, we're not going to, again, be able to. And we believe from our experience in relating and contacting congresspersons and their legislative aides that they don't really grasp the breadth in this issue. Particularly, they have a sense of money in elections and how that is not, and there are many who are quite concerned about that. But the whole issue of corporate constitutional rights, they're still trying to get, as we are, on the other side of the learning curve. And truth be told, probably almost everyone on this call is more familiar and more adept and more understanding about corporate constitutional rights, unless this is your first call, than most congresspersons, which they says something. All right, so what do we mean by rights? Well, there's two kinds. There's inalienable or unalienable, and that's basically rights that exist by birth, that can't be taken away or denied. They are just basically inherent by the fact that you are a human being and you should have certain rights. Now, those are not necessarily acknowledged in the country you live in. And that's what a constitutional right is about, to basically say that that inalienable right, or at least some of them, not all of them, because we know certain countries acknowledge certain kinds of rights and de-emphasize others. Our system is one that focuses more on political, sort of very large categorically, religious and some other kinds of rights. Other governments and institutions and ideologies, relatively speaking, focus on more economic constitutional rights, including things like right to housing and healthcare and the like, and so on. All right, so how did we begin? And so let's start basically at the beginning. The US Constitution was quite revolutionary, positive in many respects. One of the key is shifting power and control from the sovereign being, right, the king, the queen, the prince, the princess, to us, to we the people. Revolutionary, no question, in a positive way. Getting the system of checks and balances between the three branches of government, though that's not working necessarily all that well at the moment, but it's there, and thank God something like that. The power of Article 1 Constitution right away establishes, of the three branches of government, Congress, which is the branch closest to the people, really vested with the greatest amount of authority and responsibility. And there are many other features, but those are some of the very best ones in my mind. Now, despite that, there are some flaws and some blind spots to it. The Constitution, it limited, did it not, human personhood rights to white male property owners. It affirmed property rights over human rights. Remember, what we call the Bill of Rights was the first 10 amendments. They weren't originally part of that drafting of the original Constitution. And so much of the history since that original Constitution that was signed and ratified with the first 10 amendments has been a history of people that have been trying to drive themselves into the Constitution where sadly they weren't originally. All right, so what about corporations? Well, one of the good things that our founders got right is that corporations were not invested with any kinds of rights. They're not mentioned in the Constitution. There is no legal foundation. The revolution actually was in part a revolution against these things called crown corporate entities, things like the Massachusetts Bay Company, the Carolina.
Gee, Greg, you seem to have frozen up here.
Greg, we lost you.
Yeah, Greg was having problems earlier too. His internet
Company that we
cuts
that
in
we
and
need
out,
not
cuts
just
in and out a little
economic
bit.
power
So
and economic. Oh, okay.
Great.
Sorry about that.
You dropped out for about 20 seconds.
Oh, sorry about that.
That's all right.
That won't happen too often. So anyway, corporations were defined and created by we the people following the revolution as those crown corporations were constitutionalized or democratized. And so public officials, those we the people who we elect to serve us at the state level early on were those that created these corporate charters or licenses. They were granted and or revoked. And they were revoked when those companies that achieved and were given a charter which didn't have rights connected to them, only privileges granted by we the people and those we elected at the state level, chose not to follow those entities or elements of the charter. So this was intentional, this was the norm, this was the default. P.S. political money, too, had no rights. None of those charters early on allowed corporate entities to donate or invest in the political process. In fact, in a good many instances, they couldn't even donate to charitable purposes. That was meant for we the people. So here's just an example, and why we got into this notion of people who came after the colonists, the revolutionaries, where they picked up this notion. We should be the deciders, we should be the authorizers, is maybe they took this cue from King Charles I. In 1628, he granted a charter. Massachusetts Bay Company. A number of years later, he sent inspectors over to this side of the Atlantic to just see if the terms of that charter was being complied with. And those inspectors, speaking on behalf of the king, said this: "The king did not grant away his sovereignty over you. We made you a corporation. When his majesty gave you power to make wholesome laws and to administer justice by them, he parted not with his right of judging whether justice was administered accordingly or not. When his majesty gave you authority over such subjects as live within your jurisdiction, he made them not your subjects, nor you their supreme authority," unquote. That's pretty strong stuff. The language is a little flowery, but the message is crystal clear. The king was king, and everybody else was subordinate. They were taking their cues from the king, from the sovereign. And that's basically who we the people became. We took over sovereignty, and the whole idea of corporate constitutional rights was one that was sort of a corrupt and a hijacking of this notion of corporations being subordinate to we the people. And so here's just an example of where people and those that we elected, and even those judiciaries, use their democratic muscles, if you will, to rein in corporate entities that went beyond their stated authority. This from the state of Ohio in 1900, and I love this language, where in reading the charter of this dairy corporation, the state of Ohio Supreme Court said that time has now yet arrived when the created is greater than the creator. And it still remains the duty of the courts to perform their office in the enforcement of the laws, no matter how ingenious the pretexts for their violation may be, the power of the violators in the commercial world. And strong stuff in which self-defining people don't mess around. They don't negotiate, they don't plead, they don't ask, they don't hope, they authorize, they direct, they instruct. That's how it once was, and that's what we have forgotten, and that's what we need to remember. So, in corporations, they didn't take all this democratic muscle flexing sitting down. They sought to escape democratic control, and they did this in three ways. One is they shifted decision-making to define corporate entities from the state level to the federal level. So, at the time, when you're talking about 100 years ago, people were much closer, relatively speaking, to their state officials than to federal officials. So when you shift decision-making to define corporations from the state to the federal, you're removing the ability of people on the ground to have, relatively speaking, political influence. Second, they shifted making to define corporate entities from the legislative to the regulatory arena. We tend to think, do we not, that regulatory agencies are there to sort of protect us and speak on our behalf. But early on, corporate entities were more than happy to shift this decision-making from the legislative arena again, where these legislators were, relatively speaking, more close to people and were tough in establishing these corporate charters. They shifted that decision-making to the regulatory arena, the first regulatory agency being the Interstate Commerce Commission, regulating the railroads, and that was created with the blessing of railroad corporations, because it's a lot easier to sort of defend and protect yourself against regulators than it is legislators. And if you want more info, and we can talk about that later if you're interested. But then the third way they shifted decision-making was from the legislative arena to the judicial. And that's where we talk about court-granted constitutional rights, mostly legislative, or I should say mostly at the Supreme Court level. So, Eureka! Corporations were given corporate personhood by the Frankenstein monster, which basically was the courts. And basically what that does, if you think about it, is at the legislative level, we as people have at least some kind of opportunity to influence what they do. But when you shift decision-making to control and define corporations from the legislative to the judicial level, you're in a sense moving things from sort of to the castle. Inside the castle, surrounded by a moat that we, the people, are sort of on the outside, and we can clamor, we can throw stones at, we can holler, we can boo, we can cheer, but we're not on the field making the decisions. But worse yet, it's not just sort of a castle surrounded by a moat, but it's a moat with alligators in it. Forget about trying to have some kind of real influence on what happens at the judicial level. We don't have any. We basically have no power, no authority to influence, hardly any, what happens at the judicial level. So corporate constitutional rights were not originally intended. They're not inevitable. It's not like gravity. It's not like the tides. It's not irreversible. It wasn't created, these things, by any law or any regulation passed by any elected official. None of us clamored and circulated a citizen initiative to get on ballot to give corporations inalienable constitutional rights. Nothing happened. It was conscious. It was planned by corporate attorneys who went to activist judges who were corporate friendly and said, voila, we are going to invent this notion of corporate constitutional rights, bestow them on these artificial legal entities. So the effect basically is constitutional amendments and to use, misuse, or abuse provisions of the original Constitution. So let's briefly kind of get into what those mean. Richard Grossman, co-founder of the program of Corporations, Law, and Democracy, I think said this so well about sort of corporate approach to strategizing and sort of protecting their interests, and how we as liberals or progressives approach bringing about change. He said, year after year, corporate operatives drove their wealth and power institution into state corporate laws, into building corporate and government institutions of propaganda, persuasion, and coercion. Year after year, they enriched a corporate class under law. Year after year, liberals and progressives poured their energies into resisting assaults, one at a time, over and over again, splintering into single issue groups, easily channeled into one struggle at a time, few of which were about rights, and most of which promoted false histories, polluted language, and glorified seriously compromised victories. Together, we have together to assert, not in our name, not here, not there, not anywhere. While this valiant work was taking place, corporate operatives were making the rules for governing the nation. And that's the distinction between how often, too often, in fact, most of the time in the history of this country, we sort of on the progressive side, trying to work on human rights and protect and expand the rights of people, just sort of deal with things one at a time and sort of try to create laws or create regulations or create decrees. Meanwhile, the corporate crowd goes after governing rules. And governing rules in our society is the Constitution. And so basically, here's how they do it. The assumptions that I make in focusing on addressing corporate constitutional rights and corporate personhood is that corporate constitutional rights impact more than simply elections. There's a negative influence beyond money in elections. Political are not the only arena affected by corporate constitutional rights, and political free speech rights are just one of many threats to we the people's legal to self-governance. If you see a sort of common theme of these, hopefully you do, it's intentional. And that is, so many people believe that corporate constitutional rights begins and ends with just money in elections. Corporations have sort of hijacked the First Amendment, free speech, which they have and which has been misused, but that's not the only problem. And the other problems that we're going to get into very briefly, again, go way beyond money in politics. So yes, corporations have misused and hijacked the amendment. It didn't begin with Buckley versus Vallejo. That's a 1976 decision that says money is free speech. That's sort of been tool and the shield that big money and well-to-do people have used to corrupt and hijack we the people rights to self-determination by spending money. If money is free speech, then those who have money have the most. But when you get into First National Bank of Boston versus Bilotti, that's where corporations first start winning rights to spend money in elections. At that point, it was just ballot initiatives. Citizens United versus FEC, despite what most people believe, that was not the first time corporations as well as individuals were able to spend money in elections. That just sort of expanded, and it allowed direct spending on corporate entities. And, it influenced and expanded the notion of things like dark money and the ability of super rich and foreign entities to shield themselves behind things like 501c4 organizations. And so the impact of corporate money in elections was, it increased. Each and every election from 2010 onward, and it created this, basically, this affair, this disconnect between the needs and the wants of people without money were increasingly not heard. But again, we're talking about more than just First Amendment political free speech. There's a whole range of other constitutional rights that corporations have hijacked, beginning with the First Amendment right to speak. And here's an example of Florida state law granting political candidates the right to equal space to respond to criticism by a newspaper of record was overturned by the paper claiming, hey, I have the right not to speak. I don't have to give candidates equal space. That's tough luck. They've also used what's called commercial speech, another example of non-political free speech. A couple of examples here. In the 1970s, a New York state law, again, this is during the energy crisis, that called for banning all utility companies from promoting the use of electricity. Here's this area where we're trying to save electricity. We're trying to promote the use of electricity. That was overturned based on the corporation's commercial speech rights. And then this company, maybe heard about your way, a company called Pacific Gas and Electric. They weren't required to allow a ratepayer organization to include counter information to the corporations on basically issues in their billing envelope. And basically, one of the things that they were awarded was basically their right not to speak, and what the court said, their freedom of mind. Try to wrap your head around that. And in Vermont, the good people of Vermont had this radical idea, those silly people in Vermont, who they could pass a law, not even overturning, not even prohibiting, but merely just labeling the growth, the presence of bovine growth hormones in the dairy products. And the court said, no, sorry, that violates the dairy industry's right not to speak. And so we have seen instances from Exxon and Monsanto, which is now owned by Bayer, those companies shielding informants that have been known both internally in both corporations' case for many years, if many decades, that burning of fossil fuels destroys the environment. The use of toxic substances on vegetables, glyphosate, is one that destroys and causes cancer. And they've known that for years, and they've been able, oftentimes, for a good while, to shield themselves from this. And they still argue that they should not be able to, in the case of Monsanto, not be able to disclose that information because that violates their right not to. And sort of in the same direction, it's not exactly, maybe you heard the Orwell versus Hobby Lobby, where the Supreme Court recognized a for-profit corporation's claim of religious beliefs under the Religious Freedom Restoration. All right, so Fourth Amendment, it's not just First Amendment, but Fourth Amendment, designed to protect rights of privacy. But that has been misused and abused. Hale versus Henkel was sort of the first instance where many corporations previously up to that point were forced periodically to disclose what was in their books and records, or were forced to open their property for inspections. All of that changed beginning in 1906, and later, many years later, in a case called Marshall versus Barlow, where a company said, no, OSHA doesn't have the right to come on my property and inspect for a variety of ventures. It becomes very difficult up to the present time for government inspectors to check for worker safety, health safety, consumer protection, or environmental safety that may be going on in that company, on the property of that company, because corporations say you are violating my Fourth Amendment search and seizure rights. Imagine if we had that during the Enron scandal, when, if you remember, there were whole kinds of huge amounts, millions, tens of millions of dollars that were sort of off the public records, that were hidden away. And if we had had the ability to inspect, maybe we'd to and that scandal that, as a result of it not being revealed early enough, resulted in thousands of people declaring bankruptcy, losing their homes and the like. And the same with Wells Fargo Corporation. Remember all of those literally millions of accounts that were just created by the company illegally, claiming that people had all these bogus accounts that they needed to pay on. And there were millions of these unauthorized accounts that caused millions of dollars in bankruptcies in a good many cases. Again, we didn't have access to their books. If there was not something called the Fourth Amendment, we might have had a better opportunity, and there were laws on the books forcing banking corporations and companies like Enron to periodically become more transparent. Maybe these scandals would not have happened. However, the other side of the coin is certainly individuals, we don't have nearly the seizure and Fourth Amendment protections as we used to have because of things like this, right? Our iPhones and our computers and everything else that is constantly snooped on. So corporations these days seemingly have much greater search and seizure rights than human persons. Fifth Amendment, here's another one, takings rights. So this is a little hard to discern, so bear with me. This is a constitutional right that says, nor shall, it says, among its many provisions, it says, nor shall private property be taken for use without just compensation. Now, private property here was meant originally to be private property of individuals, of human beings, not of artificial entities. This decision in 1922, Pennsylvania Coal Company versus Mahon, was a law that was passed in the state of Pennsylvania that was trying to prevent mining below homes that would cause the sinking of homes. And Pennsylvania, state of Pennsylvania said, no, companies, we're going to pass this law because what's happening is all of this mining underneath people's homes is causing these homes to literally implode. People lose their homes. Many people are hurt, if not seriously injured. They went to court, Pennsylvania Coal Company. Well, wait a second. Under the Fifth Amendment, if you want to prevent coal, my company, from no longer mining coal, you have to provide fair market value, just compensation, and it's got to be for a public purpose. So literally, you have to pay me for my lost profits, whatever the fair market value would be of my inability to mine that coal underneath people's homes. Well, think about the implications of that today, when, because we are facing an emergency, you have many people in the environmental community who are saying the only way to prevent literally the climate from going to become like Venus in terms of temperature, almost, slight exaggeration, but maybe not much, almost to the extent of not being livable, is to keep this stuff in the ground so it's not burned, whether it's oil, gas, coal. But to do that, because we have this Fifth Amendment, what conceivably oil and gas and coal companies could do would be to demand compensation for current and future lost profits, using as a shield the Fifth Amendment. Fifth Amendment, equal protection and due process. Those of you out in Santa Clara County may be already somewhat familiar with this case. I'm not going to get into it too much other than to say that this one gave corporations this notion of discriminating against me versus other kinds, or me as a corporation versus human beings. And so we have seen that the implication and the implementation of that 14th Amendment, applying equal protection for the first century after its enactment, was that it was applied in many more instances toward corporations and not in applying to the Negro race, which of course, 14th Amendment was 3 Supreme Court decisions after the Civil War. So equal and due process basically meant that corporations, you no longer have the ability, we do, to favor local businesses over chain stores, to oppose the siting of cell phone towers, to favor, for example, family businesses over agribusinesses and other corporate actions. Lastly, corporate hijacking, it's not of a constitutional amendment, but it's sort of an abuse of a piece of the Constitution called the Clause. And here, the Commerce Clause says Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with Indian tribes. But the implication of that and the application of that is over the past century, corporations have used the Commerce Clause, forced their way into municipalities and to states, saying things like hazardous waste is basically not hazardous waste, but commerce. And so you can't prevent us, a company, from going into your state and dumping hazardous waste into your state, and you thinking that you have the ability to prevent that from happening. And this has happened literally hundreds of times over the 100 years. So all of these add up to, as this guy in Occupy DC wearing this t-shirt says, our country is broken because the system is fixed. And so is it not time, we're all right now involved in trying to get over this new pandemic. Well, we definitely need to end the new pandemic so that we can get back to trying to deal with the old pandemic. And the old pandemic, that infection is being carried by rats, in this case, in this picture, is corporate constitutional rights that is infected and that is causing disease to what is left, to whatever extent of democracy we ever had. And so we need to keep in mind that the scale of the solutions that we're focusing on must match the scale of the problems that we're addressing. For example, if the problems are, your boat is sinking or an ocean liner is sinking, you don't solve it by trying to scoop out water with a teaspoon, a sponge, your hand, or with a cup. Instead, if it's sort of a boat, you use a bucket or a big bucket. If it's in the case of ocean liner, you use a massive, plunger or pump, like what is visualized there. Also, if you're having a stick of butter, you don't use to cut a stick of butter with a chainsaw. That's inappropriate. But so is using a butter knife and trying to cut out or cut down a dead tree. You need to make sure that the scale of the solutions match the scale of the problem. Minor problems require minor solutions. Problems within the existing system, you need to reform. But the problems that I believe we're talking about, problems of the existing system, require a systemic solution, a transformative solution. And so that's what the amendment is. And that if we were able to end or abolish corporate constitutional and this equally bizarre doctrine of money equaling free speech, here's some of the things we could do. We could establish limits on the amount of money spent on political campaigns. We could limit campaign seasons. We could enact not just voluntary, but mandatory public finance electoral campaigns. We could prohibit all direct and indirect political campaign donations from corporations to political candidates and public officials. We could prevent corporate mergers and prohibit corporations from owning stock in other corporations. We could do it. You can do that now, but it's very difficult to do, particularly prohibiting corporations from owning stock in other corporations. You could also provide people the no harmful ingredients in their food and consumer groups. You could inspect for environmental or health violations without a warrant or notice. You could revoke corporate charters by popular referendum. Citizen initiatives could be launched to dissolve entities. You could levy differential taxes for corporations, restrict their size, and provide preferential treatment to local businesses and family farmers, which right now you can't do because that discriminates under the 14th Amendment. And finally, you could prevent corporations from dumping toxic waste in our backyards, which again violates the Commerce Clause. So all of these things are things to do, which is why it's so important to focus on strategizing on how we need to pass the We the People Amendment. So I'll just end by going over a couple of things that we are working on nationally, and we invite you to work on where you are in Santa Clara County. So we have two strategies. You know, all social movements in the past basically have had, so to speak, an inside strategy and an outside strategy. The inside strategy of the system is vote and try to pass the We the People Amendment. We have 74 co-sponsors right now in the House. Our goal this year in 2020 is 75, so we're almost there. And our goal is also to have this introduced in the Senate. But the outside strategy, more or less at the grassroots level, is what you have been doing and many of us nationally have been doing, to pass resolutions, to get initiatives on the ballot and pass. And between those two things, 680 communities around the country have done one or both of those. Pledge to amend is to get candidates running for office at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, to say, if I'm elected, I will pledge to work to implement the We the People Amendment, to pass a resolution, to co-sponsor, whatever the case may be. Several hundred have done that. Organizational endorsements. Organizations to say, wait a second, it's tough for me to do what I want to do in passing and working on the law or working on the change I'm working on until we work together to pass the We the People. Hundreds of organizations, labor, religious, good government groups have passed organizations saying we support the We the People Amendment. Connecting issues and groups, focusing on key constituencies. We have special attention that we at the national level focus on in terms of caucuses or subcommittees within Move to Amend that focuses on reaching out to three main constituencies: labor, people of faith and ethical persuasions, and young people, because those have been the groups that historically have overturned and worked to overturn the amendment. Lastly, to build organizational capacity, to have more affiliates, to have more advocates, to have more members, to create more caucuses, and of course, to try to collect more cash. We are operating under a financial, as many organizations are under the pandemic. So anything you can do or any people you know who can help us out would be great. All of our staff right now are furloughed. Hopefully that will change in the short term once we kind of replenish our bank accounts. So anything you can do to help us out would be great. Here's just a listing of past social movements and democracy movements that basically have happened and only happened when people have come together. These haven't happened these haven't happened basically from the top down. They have happened because people have worked sort of on the inside, and certainly we need people inside who are advocates, who support us, who are legislators, who are working to change those kinds of things, to introduce those amendments, to bring those kind of changes. But most, I mean, truth be told, most of why those things have happened on that list are because people have organized widely and deeply and come together and have built power. And now we have the Me Too movement, March for Our Lives, Black Lives Matter, the climate crisis, and a burgeoning authentic democracy movement. You know, it's been said, if you don't change directions, you're going to likely end up where you're headed. And where we are headed right now is not pretty. And so where we need to do is focus away from what Richard Grossman said, from sort of those one at a time, one issue at a time, you know, one boycotting one vegetable at a time, one article of clothing at a time. There's a lot of fruits and vegetables out there that we could be boycotting one at a time. And we should be when it's appropriate. But if that's all we do, if that's all we focus on is the one at a time and not focus as corporations do on the rulemaking, on the governance, we're always going to be playing defense. So here's how we focus and encourage people to take action: by educating those things that are listed there, by supporting Move to Amend. If you're not on our mailing list and you want to join 500,000 people who have signed our petitioning calling for the constitutional amendment, pull out your cell phone right now and text amend to that number, 707-656-4019. There's the link to donate. You can help organize by getting active or more active with the Santa Clara affiliate, to seek endorsements from groups and municipalities. Ask your federal officials, if you already haven't, to co-sponsor the We the People Amendment, HJR 48. Ask your state elected officials to pledge to amend, and join us to seek to build a broad democracy movement. I close by basically quoting Sally Kempton, who is, I think she, yoga instructor and futurist and the like. She says, it's hard to fight an enemy who has outposts in your head. And basically we have been conditioned, have we not, to sort of told, you're too stupid, you don't know enough, you're not skilled enough, you're not enough, you're not in an important position enough to do anything that's meaningful. And so we've conditioned to believe that. We've been conditioned to believe that what we can do falls into this narrow box of changing a law or a regulation or creating a mandate, not focusing on the rulemaking. And so we censor ourselves. We've had these outposts that have been built into our heads that we have to acknowledge and get rid of. Again, this is not something that's inevitable, that's irreversible. It's not like the tides. It's not like the swans returning to Capistrano every year, March, April, whenever it happens out in California. It's been intentional, and what has been done can be undone, and we need to be the people to undo it. Thanks much. Here's just a little poem we put together about the We the Amendment. Hey, my name is Coleridge, so I've got to try to live up to the tenor of Samuel T. Not related, but no decree, regulation, or law is sufficient. No election of any public official is efficient. Not simply about Citizens United cursing, not even Buckley versus Vallejo reversing. Abolishing corporate constitutional rights via an amendment is where we set our sights. And the only proposed amendment that is great is the We the People Amendment, HJR 8. So nature never gives up, and neither, bloody, darn it, should we. So, sorry it took so long. Questions, comments, feel free to let's cuss and discuss all of this.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yay, very good.
Greg, I have a question I'd like to ask, just to kind of clarify things. Is the reason why we're doing this in the form of an amendment because back years ago, the Supreme Court in the Citizens United decision decided to make money speech and corporations people, and that in order to overturn the Supreme Court decision, it has to be in the form of an amendment? Or if, let's say, the legislature were to just pass not an amendment, but some other form of legislation, that would not overturn the Supreme Court decision. Is that correct?
Well, if the problem, if the problems we're talking about began for the very first time, both these elements of money speech and corporate constitutional rights began in 2010 with Citizens United, then we could focus our attention on Citizens United and say, well, we could try to bring a case that works through the courts to overturn Citizens United. We could have a constitutional amendment that specifically focuses on Citizens United. We couldn't overturn Citizens United by law, by passing something in Congress or having the president, whoever he or she may be, give a presidential decree. Can't do it. So if it's a constitutional decision, the few ways to overturn it would be to have another, decision that comes before the court to overturn it, or to have an amendment. But the problem that I've tried to identify is much larger, much longer, much wider, much deeper than Citizens United. We can reverse Citizens United tomorrow. Think about it. if we reverse Citizens United tomorrow, we go back, right, to the grand, glorious, democratic nirvana, right, of January 1st, 2010. Remember those good old days when our voices were authentically heard, our needs met, all of our communities helped and served? You remember those days? I don't. No, because the problem's transcended. Why we need this constitutional amendment that more broadly and deeply speaks to abolishing all corporate constitutional rights and money of speech is to take out, to abolish, to reverse, to make inert Citizens United, plus all those other constitutional hijacks that I mentioned, plus the doctrine that money is goes back to 1976, Buckley versus Vallejo.
Can I ask a question?
Yes. And I apologize, really. I am so sorry for going so fast, but I tried to get it all
Oh,
in.
no.
And,
I
and
don't-
this
you-
will be, this is taped, so we will send it out. I'll send the link to everyone who's registered, actually, on whether they actually participate in this call or not. I'll make sure you get a copy of the link to these slides.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, speaking for anybody else, but I mean, you didn't have to sell me on anything, but I have the thing that you talked about with time is kind of what I want to focus on, because I've been signing petitions, against Citizens United for 20 years or whatever. I have old car bumper stickers that have, wasted away, over time. I mean, it takes so long. And I feel like, how can you get rid of money when the campaigning never stops? I mean, we don't have a country that has any limits on campaigning. It goes on forever. Our official period is 18 months. So the thing that kind of caught my attention, because I know in other countries, you can have restrictions like only 3 months of campaigning, and then it's illegal to campaign while you're in office because you have a job to do. So, I mean, I don't know how I just feel like our government is it's lost so much. I don't know, it needs a total overhaul now. But to me, this endless campaigning, I mean, I am not capable of continuing to sign petitions every single day of my life without end. And, and give money, I mean, I give my little tiny, $3 or $10, and I mean, I don't have the money to give, but I can give my vote. But, to stay on top of it every single day of our, lives, when a lot of us are working, we have lives. I mean, so that idea of time, limiting the time of these campaignings, there's no other country that does this, what we do. There is no other country that we have eternal campaigns. And the only thing that you can do eternally is it has to take money. And it's only used for slander and lies, because, I mean, how, you state your position on something and you really only have to state it once. So, I mean, I would say 3 months of publicly funded debates so that you can see who presents themselves well is, the only thing that we would really need. Anyway, I'm just I guess I'm going on and on, but I never hear anything about limiting our election time. And I want so badly to hear it, because I feel like, how can you get rid of the money if people are supposed to be endlessly and always campaigning? And it's not out there in the front. It should be glaring to me. It should be glaring to the height, that, 3 months of campaigning and then get to work. And
Yeah.
Well, I think you've expressed a sentiment that's shared by many, many people, a frustration that's shared by many, many people. It's absolutely true. It's absolutely a problem. But what you wish for in trying to limit campaigns is absolutely impossible under the current system, because of money being defined as free speech.
Exactly.
Because if we said, okay, only a year before, some candidate's going to say, well, wait a second, or 2 years before I want to start spending money, you can't stop me. That'd be a violation of my free speech, because money is speech. So until we get rid of this, we cannot do what other countries do. You can't even have public financing.
Well, we can't do anything with our present government anyway. I mean, unless it changes, there's no hope for anything. But
I think the frustration, in part, And where I have hope in sort of a perverted way is, we're seeing all crises out there now, but one crisis that, is out there, but it's not as in our face as the pandemic and the economic crisis and police brutality and the like, is that people are losing trust in government.
So maybe
And
that's to our advantage.
What holds it? Think about it. What holds any society together? Any society, from caveman up to the present time, any community, you have got to have a certain degree of trust among people within that community. And if you lose trust among those who are supposed to represent you, you are in deep trouble. We are in deep trouble.
So you'd
So
say it's
herein lies both the crisis and opportunity, because we do have an opportunity to take advantage of the fact that why people are so distrusting of public officials is, in fact, that there is this disconnect between what we want and oftentimes what public officials give us, because they oftentimes are more beholden to their donors and not to their voters. So we need to call for changes that will try to strengthen that trust. And that's part of what the We the People Amendment is calling for.
Thank
Okay,
you.
other questions,
Are there other questions?
comments? Let me see if anybody put anything in these.
Lisa, you can unmute yourself, or do you need, you're muted.
Anybody can unmute, should be able to unmute yourself.
Go ahead, Lisa.
I decided to take a political science course at San Jose State. And I'm reading this book, The Politics of Power by Katz Nelson, Kesselman, and Draper. They really outline all of these problems that you're outlining about the corporate stranglehold on our democracy, the roots of it. And it sounds like you need like an expert, like you're saying that you need a constitutional academic or attorney to advise you on these issues. Maybe like a think tank of constitutional academics who are willing to work for this kind of amendment, transformative amendment. And also I'd like to say that Congress needs to reform itself. The lobby money, they're talking about the amount of lobby money spent, in a 5-year period by insurance and I don't know, this group of 3. It was like over $5 billion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Another thing was dark money coming. I was doing some phone banking for some progressive candidates. And at the last minute, all this dark money flooded into the airwaves,
Right.
To, suppress or to, I guess, cause problems for the candidates that I was campaigning for. But so where did this money come from? I don't know.
Yeah, it is part of it is part of a longstanding problem that, we're not really going to be able to get to unless we, again, focus on, the big problem requires a big solution. And yeah, we do need experts, no question. We need constitutional scholars, move to amend. We do have what we call a law and research committee. One of your very own, John Fioretta, is on that. He does tremendous work with some of his colleagues and has produced some, work that any constitutional scholar, I think, would blush at for its professionalism and its rigor. But we do need other people, no question, who have the letters behind their names. But we also need people like all of you have PhDs in what it's like to live right now in this system, in which our system has been hijacked by corporate entities and big money. So we are the experts and can talk from our experience about that. And we know, some of us, a good deal about this topic. Again, it doesn't take much to get your other, to get on the other side of the learning curve, to know more than people, political power at the city, state, and federal on these issues, to where you will be instructing them, you will be educating them on this topic. So yeah, we need both. We need sort of people on the inside, people on the outside. Go ahead, Judith.
Yeah, basically what I want to say is that in terms of the language, there are some people that are put off by the language that use the political language and the yeah, political language. And after a while, you get a hang for it. You do. One thing I learned, though, I want to make really, really clear, and I have this conversation with a lot of friends. And one thing I have learned from Move to Amend is that I will not allow any thought in my head that this can't happen. It can happen. Women's rights. Susan B. Elizabeth Cady Stanton died 20 years before it was ever passed, and they were extremely influential. So if I have to kick the bucket, and it's still, I don't think that's going to be the case, but I refuse to believe that this is not going to happen. It is. Thank you. I'm done.
I like that one.
That's inspiring, and I agree with you.
Yay.
I think
All right.
either this happens, or we go totally fascist. I mean, basically, I don't mean to be melodramatic or rhetorical, but I do believe, and are we not seeing some of the fundamental problem not be resolved by doing the old kind of ways? We've been kicking the can down the road economically and environmentally. No, you cannot have the sort of, I think, transformative sort of environmental changes that's required to have sustainable life without something like this happening.
Are they on yet?
Go ahead.
Wait, this should be over in a minute.
The other thing I would like to comment on is, Lisa, your age group. I'd like to see more of your age group, and I'd like to see people younger. I'd like to see some teenagers on these calls. If all of us put our heads together, I'll bet we can come up with a group of young people. There is a group of, there are young people out there, but there needs to be more. And your initial focus is, and there's always been the worry to me that, and again, with a lot of friends, it's money and politics. And I start out with, no, it's corporate personhood, and then it's money and politics. If we don't, we've got to change that thing out and get people to think corporate personhood ahead of time. And we've been younger people involved. Clearly we do. So anything that we can do to increase those numbers and increase that focus from Citizens United, American Promise, and those folks who are going to deal with money, that's it. That's all they're going to deal with. If we can get more people to understand the other side of this thing, or the more important side of this thing, and focus more on some younger folks, it's going to be more advantageous to the cause. Thank you.
We do have something called I mentioned
Next Gen.
We have what's called Next Gen Caucus. So if any of you, or of any person, I think it's like under 40, who would like to be involved in that, hit me up. My email is greg@movetoamend.org, and I can get you in touch with the convener of that. I can't remember what, they meet on a Monday. I don't know which Monday of the month. But
Okay.
I will try to include in the follow-up email with the link to the slides notice about the Next Gen Caucus.
All right. Thank you so much, Greg. Big round of applause.
All right, let me just say that if any of you, get off the call, if you have any questions that were not answered, feel free to either email me, or when I send out the email, you want to cuss or discuss anything about this, feel free. Let's go at it.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, Greg.
You. Good job.
Good job. Okay. You want to stay?
Okay.